please find your seats, take your seats, so that we can start. I still hope that throughout the morning other colleagues would arrive. I can imagine that it's not that easy anymore to get from the airport here. But anyhow, lovely morning to all of you for our extraordinary group meeting today. You have seen from the agenda that we are having really important and at the same time interesting issues on our agenda. But let me start by guiding you through the language regime. So we are having active, so you can speak and listen to French, German, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Czech, Latvian, Hungarian, Polish, Slovene, and Bulgarian. And we've got passive, so you can speak but not listen to Dutch, Danish, Finnish, Swedish, Estonian, Lithuanian, Maltese, Slovak, Romanian, and Croatian. So it's really very full language regime. So at the same time, I kindly ask you to use your language as these are available. Having said this, you know that our today's main topic is the cost of living crisis. It's the issue that is in the pipeline as one of the really flagship initiative for the upcoming period till the end of our current mandate. We all know that we are going to have an umbrella opinion on the issue, as well as all the sections, sectoral opinions, delivering from the different angles. I know that in the bureaus of the different sections, the debate has been led and decisions are being made on the concrete name of the concrete opinion. It was not me, it was someone behind me, I guess, Ivan. So let me just start with a brief introduction, but still before that, let me tell you that we are starting with Gonzalo VELASCO, giving us the public from the EPDG COMM Public Opinion Monitoring Unit. Welcome. Guiding us a bit through the different polls and opinion in the EU among the citizenship of the EU before and after the elections connected with the issue we are going to be debating. Then we've got a panel with very distinguished speakers as well on different angles on the cost of living crisis. I am happy to announce that we are having a cocktail in the lunch break in the foyer of the 6th floor. And in the afternoon, we are going to be reflecting on the issues, on the inputs we have heard this morning, and also a debate with Group 3 President Seamus Boland on his potential priorities for his potential term as the EESC President. Okay, let me start by saying that in 1992, Bill Clinton won the US election under a very simple, direct slogan, "Is the economy stupid?" It resonated well with the Americans suffering the crisis at the same time. The writing was and is still on the wall. The latest Eurobarometer showed inflation and the economy as broadly the main worries of Europeans before the elections. And a certain Trump has won the election in the US by a fair margin on the grounds of inflation and cost of living for average Americans. Macroeconomic indicators have given path in the back to many governments in Europe. However, the cost of essential goods, of food, of energy rose sharply and never truly went down. Workers and citizens in already precarious situations are massively affected by this. Poverty and social exclusions are some of the largest worries of our citizens, and for good reason. It's also worth remembering that very high energy costs also hurt any hope for a competitive industry in Europe in the near future. For decades, wages have been decoupled from productivity growth. Hope of a better future has been fading in many EU countries, and this latent discontent has slowly but surely eroded our democratic systems. These days, after a crisis in 2008 and its austerity response, and then the consequences of the pandemic and the inflation after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have already some results. Extremism and far-right political forces from a century ago are resurfacing as disinformation and manipulation directed frustrated voters into blaming migrants or the fight against climate change. Trade unions have been warning about this for many years. As working conditions deteriorated, income for the working and middle classes stalled or decreased, and future perspectives for our youth faded away. The feeling of unfairness of a rigged system spread like a wildfire among our population, and we can't just blame fake news and Putin for everything. This is why we are here today, as part of a long effort to tackle the cost of living crisis, to discuss its many sides, its origins and possible solutions, and ultimately to carry the conclusions forward in our organizations and to our policymakers. The fact that the title of the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights is back is already a positive sign. But workers in Europe will not feed their families of science. Deep, thorough changes are needed in how our economy is organized, taxes levied, and finances managed. We must act before our citizens decide that this costly and cumbersome system of government we call democracy is not longer working for them. By the time everyone realizes the alternative is far worse, it might be too late. You know that we have been talking about this already for some time after the elections, but again, I'm stressing it's to hear from the experts from the outside, from the different angles, how the cost of living crisis is actually impacting us, and how could we just take it and put it through the opinions of cost of living crisis on the table. So by this, I would like to give the floor to Francesco Vasco, Gonzalo VELASCO, oh my goodness. Sorry, Gonzalo VELASCO Monasterio. The floor is yours for the scene setting, and of course we are going to have a lot of questions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. President. So I'm very happy to be here in front of you, speaking about the Eurobarometer and our latest data, and to bring citizens' voice into the room and into the discussion. So I will be mainly talking about the latest results of the post-electoral survey, our post-electoral survey. I come from the European Parliament, from the Public Opinion Monitoring Unit. We are one of the services in the EU making surveys about the attitudes towards the EU, but in this case we conducted a quite, if this, oh, okay.
Okay,
it's working. Yeah. So in this, sorry for that. In this case, we have conducted a very unique survey, which is the post-electoral study. Why is it unique? Because it's the only post-electoral study that surveys people with the same methodology and with the same questionnaire through the EU 27 member states. And why also it's a unique survey is because it has been done in the highest standards, methodological standards, which is the face-to-face method, and it has done immediately after the elections. So citizens' minds are still fresh, and we can get the best polls and the best opinions immediately after the European elections. So I will be speaking today about three main blocks. So first of all, I will focus, of course, on the cost of living. and what this survey and some other Eurobarometers say about this specific topic. Then I will be revising a little bit and setting the ground for the current state of the attitudes towards the EU, which are very linked, of course, to the issue. And then I will do a small post-electoral analysis and voters profile, which I think it also should be very important for the sake of today's meeting. So, as the President was saying, the rising prices and the cost of living was the main topic why citizens voted in the recent European elections, followed by the economic situation. So we have at the top the two main topics that are very connected to today's issue, today's topic, and which were the main topics by far. This was slightly, or youth was slightly less likely to select these topics, although for them it was as well, there were as well the main topics in order to go to vote. Then we have some other topics that were also, of course, very important for citizens, which are the international situation, democracy and the rule of law, the environment and climate change. This was specifically important for youth. Migration and asylum, and the security and defense. Here I highlight as well education and gender equality, which were also a bit more important for youth than for the other age groups. Which was the situation 5 years ago, so in the previous European elections? Okay, this is more or less the same question, but the topics are different, so we cannot directly compare the two answers. But at that time, we also had economy and growth at the first place. But we have seen some changes, specifically regarding climate change and environment, which it was the second priority, and it was very important for youth. As you might remember, Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, all these played a very important role in the last European elections, and now it's not the case anymore, or at least at the same at the same importance as it was at that time. Also, migration was higher last time. It was also closer to the migrant crisis in the EU in time, and social protection this time is a bit lower than it was at the time. So of course this is not only reflected here, but as you can imagine, of course, is reflected on the results of the elections. Yeah, but if we go down to the country picture, so to the results country by country, there is a big chunk of countries here in the slide, the ones in orange and the ones in dark blue, that are where the main topic was the cost of living and the economic situation. So many countries from the eastern side, but not only, and from the Mediterranean mainly. Then we have the usual suspects when it comes to environment and climate change, so the Nordic countries, but also the Netherlands and Malta, and then some countries like the Baltics and Finland and Luxembourg that are more concerned about the international situation or the EU's defense and security. The big outlier here, and big in terms of size, was Germany, which had as a main priority migration and asylum. So this is the picture only for rising prices and the cost of living. It varies a lot from the countries where this is more of a priority. For example, Greece, 70% of citizens went to vote because of this topic. Portugal, 59%, Bulgaria, 56%, Croatia, Ireland, Slovakia, and Hungary. And then in the Nordic countries, in the Netherlands, in Latvia as well, this issue was less of a priority for citizens. But we posed the same question to the abstainers, so not only to the voters. And here it's even more clear that rising prices and the cost of living was the main topic for them. So 46% of the non-voters, or of the abstainers, picked this issue, this topic, as their main reason that would have encouraged them to vote. So here there is, in my view, an important way or a window of opportunity in order to bring these citizens to the ballot. Again, followed by the economic situation. And here, social protection, welfare, and access to healthcare comes third. In terms of the country by country picture, here is way more clear. So for a big majority of member states, rising prices and the cost of living was the main topic for abstainers. Here the outlier is Ireland, with housing being even more important for them. We know that is a big issue there. And here I brought a evolution table, a trend line from the Commission. This is a series of Eurobarometers. It's not the same question, but a very similar one, which is the main issue for EU citizens. And here we can see the evolution for rising prices and inflation at the EU level in blue, and at the national level in dark red. What I wanted to show here is the evolution over the last decade. It was remaining at a low position in citizens' minds until especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where it peaked at 54% in the case of and the national level, and at 34% in the case of the EU level. And now it has bounced back a little bit, but it's still at a higher level than it was ever before in the last decade. So from here we can also see that in citizens' mind, this is more of a national issue, but still also slight lower, but also a EU-level issue that has to be addressed. The situation at a personal level also changed a little bit. This is the evolution of the standard, or the expected evolution of the standard of living in the next 5 years. So we still have a 55% of EU citizens, so a majority that think that their standard of living will not change over the next 5 years. But a very important 26% that think that the standard of living will decrease over the next 5 years, and only a 16% of citizens that think that their standard of living will increase. It's true that this economic picture at the personal level has developed and has decreased over the last, in this case, the comparison is with 6 months before, and now we have less citizens thinking or expecting that their standard of living will decrease over the next 5 years, but still this is a quite high number of citizens, 1/4 of EU citizens thinking that they will be in a worse situation over the next 5 years. In terms of the country perspective here, the situation has improved in a big majority of member states, so at least in 25, I think, or 24, being a better and more positive situation when comparing to February 2024. So in this picture of a standard of living crisis, where is the opinion or citizens' opinion towards the EU standing? This is also a very important trend line for us. This is the image of the European Union, which is one of our main indicators in order to measure what is the citizens' opinion about the European Union. Since, in this case, 2013, so for more or less 10, 11 years. For the last legislative period, we have the most positive ever positive image of the European Union, which is the blue line, which peaked in a sort of rally around the EU flag effect in two times, so immediately after the COVID crisis and immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the cost of living crisis at that time. And now we are still at, well, at a very high level, but it has bounced back again, and we are now at the 48% of citizens that have a positive image of the EU. This is followed by 36% that think that they have a neutral image, and only 16% of citizens have a negative image of the EU. In terms of is it EU membership of my country beneficial or not, here we have a big majority of citizens, more than 2/3 of EU citizens saying yes. Our country has benefited from being a member of the EU. This correlates with education, so citizens that hold a higher level of education also think that their country has benefited more or are more likely to think so. And why have their countries benefited from being a member of the EU? Well, in first place, citizens say that this is because the membership of the EU improves cooperation between their country and other countries of the EU. First, and very important in the current international context, because it contributes to protecting peace and strengthening security. And then at the third and fourth position, it comes because it contributes to economic growth, and it brings national people new work opportunities. So here, the cost of living or the economic issues play a very important role as well when it comes to the opinion that citizens. There seems to be a problem with translations for Italians, I think. Is it okay? No?
Try to keep on
Okay.
talking. Is it okay?
Okay.
Lovely.
So specifically for some of the countries, so for example, for Croatia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Czechia, the new work, the fact that the EU brings their nationals new work opportunities is the main reason why they think their country benefits from being a member of the EU. And then for another 6 countries, Ireland, Malta, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Spain, and Austria, they think that the economic growth is the main issue or the main reason why their country benefits from being a member of the EU. Finally, let me just do a very quick voters profile analysis, post-electoral analysis of the European elections, because this was one of the main goals of this survey. So first of all, as you know, we remain stable at this is the turnout for the last European elections and the comparison with 2019. As you know, at the EU level, we remain stable. We remain at the 50.74% of turnout, which, however, it increased the turnout comparing with the last European elections in a majority of member states, so in 16 out of 27. But why does the European or the turnout at the EU level remains the same? Because in 3 of the 5 big member states that explain 70% of the EU turnout, the turnout has substantially decreased. So, for example, in Spain, there was a a decrease of 16 points. In Poland also there was an important decrease in turnout, and in Italy as well. Then for France it's more or less stable, and in Germany it's true that we saw a 2-3 points increase. But who are these 51% of European citizens who voted? So first of all, men were slightly more likely than women to cast their vote, but it correlates a lot with age. So elder fellow Europeans were more likely to vote, way more likely to vote actually than youth, which by the way decreased from last time. And again, the turnout is correlating, and not only in this election, this is the case for almost every election, but it's correlating with level of education. So the longer you stayed in education, the more likely you are to participate in elections, and in this case as well. If we cross, and coming back to the topic of the meeting, if we cross turnout with the personal situation, economic situation of EU citizens, so in the left side of the slide, difficulties paying bills at the end of the month, we see that the ones that almost never experience these difficulties to make ends meet were way more likely to participate in European elections than the one that have these difficulties most of the time. So only 35% of these citizens having economic trouble at the personal level participated in the European elections. Here as well, I see an important window of opportunity to resonate with these voters if bringing the topic of the cost of living, of the inflation, of the economy to the campaign. And on the right part of the slide, we see the subjective socioeconomic class. Okay, this is of course only measured by the impression of themselves that citizens have when they answer to the survey. But again, we see an important correlation with the perceived or the self-perceived class. So the upper you go in the self-perceived class, the more likely you were to vote, and the working class, which is the one that we have here at the below in the chart. These the citizens in the lower class were way less likely to vote. Only 39% of them did so. Finally, the citizens' perception of EU's impact on their daily lives. This is also at a very high level. More than 2/3 of EU citizens think that the actions of the EU have an impact on their daily lives, so 72%. And the ones who feel this also were way more likely to vote. 77% of them voted, whereas for the ones who don't think so, were more likely to abstain. This was it from our side. I invite you to go to our website and take a look at this and other studies. As you know, the European Commission, for example, has a lot of surveys covering every single topic that is addressed at the EU level. And specifically for our study, we have asked for the voting behavior of citizens. So we also have data on parties that can be crossed as well with the priorities of the citizens and so on and so forth. So please take a look. And that was it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Very interesting. I mean, some of the findings one would normally perceive, but if someone just puts it on the table and visualize, it works for it speaks for itself. I mean, it's obvious for myself that issues like peace, democracy, which were not that obvious and visible with the previous elections are obviously coming to the forefront with the situation evolving throughout the world. So the dividend, peace dividend we have been actually consuming throughout the last, I would say, decades is no more on the table. So this also impacting the different budget spendings of the national states for defense and so on would be definitely impacting also the living standards of people because of lack of spending or investment in other spheres of the life. I mean, also the impact on democracy and democratic structures you've mentioned is also becoming obvious. And I mean, we can see the evidence already in the different firstly with the EU elections, but also with the different national elections throughout the EU, which is rather worrying than whatsoever else. So making the clear link between the cost of living and then the perception and political sentiments of population in the different countries should be also, I mean, stressed and analyzed further so that we could find appropriate responses. I mean, I would have a lot of questions, on your presentation. I hope we can send it round and use it because I can see that these visualized, survey could be very well used, to increase the awareness about the different, aspects of it. But for the moment, I am opening the debate, questions and answers round. I can see Carlos. I can see Andrea, I can see Javier, I can see Stefano, Philip, Willem. I read the list. I hope I've got everyone, but if not, put your hand up. I've got Carlos Silva, I've got Andrea Monet, I've got Javier Dos, I've got Stefano Palmieri, I've got Philip from Burgdorf, and William Rebic. Anyone else for this first round? So we can start with Carlos. If we manage to keep it within 3 minutes, I would be really happy. Carlos, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Lucie. Good morning. I will speak in Portuguese for our colleague from Spain. Bem, muito bom dia a todos. Eu vou ser rápido, como é habitual.
Thank you. I'll try and keep this brief, as is my wont. Thank you very much, Carlos, for presenting this rather interesting study. There are a couple of aspects here in the study that confirm what many people in society think, what trade unions think about what left-wing governments have been doing, including my own government in Portugal. It's one which was Antonio Costa led for about 8 years. And I'd like to just pick up on what Carlos said said at the end. And you were talking about people with the lowest salaries. They didn't actually go out to vote. And they struggled to make ends meet. And they were basically the people who didn't go out and cast a vote. So there's something missing here when it comes to the social state. So I think, the soul of European democracy, left-wing parties, they're opening the door to lots of other governments in Europe which actually show many of the same characteristics as the right-wing visitors do. So I think we have to work on an opinion on this. We represent the workers, and the workers are the ones who suffer most from poverty and the dismantling of the social state. So there are a lot of issues here which are close to the hearts of many trade unionists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Andrea, please.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in Italian. Grazie. Vado subito.
Thank you. I'll move straight to my question so that colleagues also have an opportunity to take the floor. Could I just know whether during these interviews that you held, apart from looking at the critical issues and what the main concerns were of the respondents in terms of how they voted, whether there was also some kind of understanding of those concerns. Did you ask those that you interviewed whether, apart from the rising prices and the rise of cost of living, whether they understood the underlying reasons for that rise? It's important to see whether they understand the contributing factors to it. To give you an example, energy prices, understanding the energy issues should lead to them understanding that we need greater European integration and integration of the energy markets. When it comes to the cost of living and those increases, now, if they understand that social dialogue needs to be increased because their purchasing power has decreased, then they understand that there's a benefit to be had to being part of the European Union. So I was just wondering, when you ask these people about what their concerns are, do you also ask them whether they understand why those concerns are there?
Javier, please go ahead.
Sí, lo primero.
I'm going to speak Spanish. I'd like to start by thanking you for this rather interesting synthesis of the Eurobarometer study. It is very much in line with surveys conducted in my country, Spain. Inflation, the increase in the cost of living. This is something we're very concerned about and very much tied in with the whole issue of housing. This is giving rise to massive protests in Spain. Furthermore, and we're going to have a whole issue around rent rises, and there's a proposal that people will stop paying rent. There'll be a rent strike. Whether it will happen or not remains to be seen. The people, obviously, which are doing, very, very well. You're getting people with much greater incomes coming as tourists to Spain. And, a huge proportion of the housing stock is being made available to, tourists as rental accommodation. And that's giving rise to a kind of sentiment which is anti-tourist at the moment. Anyway, having said all that, I would like to have one question. I mean, you raced through the various charts and graphs, and I didn't have time to absorb it all. Now, about inflation, punishing governments which haven't been in power for very long. I think it punishes those on the right less than those on the left. I'm thinking about, Spain here, left-wing government, and then in many other countries it's a coalition. If you're talking about centre-right governments, coalition governments, now maybe the data don't exist and you're not able to reply to this off the cuff, but I think basically the left-wing governments are punished most, or right or left-wing parties in coalition governments, while those on the right are punished less. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie, Lucie.
Thank you, Lucie. And thank you to Gonzalo as well, of course, for his excellent presentation. I'd like to come back to what Carlos was saying. I believe that progressive political forces in Europe are no longer in a position, are no longer able to reply a policy response which is convincing to their reference electorate, which is the workers. For the past 20 years, progressive political forces in many European countries, in a bid to broaden their reference electorate, have decided to offer a leftist liberal platform along the lines of what Tony Blair did. And that is something that was pushed in many of our countries in Europe. It's certainly the case in Italy, Germany and France. This approach was taken on, and the results were very moderate. A lot of progressive politicians espoused liberal policies and moved away from their reference electorate, which is the workers. And in many European countries, workers now vote for political forces to the right and extreme right of the spectrum. And between a leftist government that has right-wing policies or a right-wing government with right-wing policies, you will always choose the original one, and that's what they've done. And I'd make a further point. These left-wing governments, when they were in government, didn't manage to have a leftist approach to governance. And when it came to the Stability and Growth Pact, they didn't manage to put their stare on it either. And that has left us in a situation today whereby in regions where there is a development trap, you see that workers are now voting for political parties with a right-wing and extreme right-wing platform and policies. And I think we need to fully understand that that is the situation.
Thank you very much. Philip van Broekdorp, please.
Thank you, Lucy. Għanitkellem bil-Malti, allura ovvjament.
I shall speak in Maltese, so please put your headphones on. So I will speak about the context in Malta and how the prices are in Malta. In Malta, prices are 9% less than the European average.
Getting through, some are not.
Okay, so I switch to English.
I'm okay with Czech language, but which languages are not getting through?
Is the English interpretation coming through? No, the speaker can speak in Maltese.
Please,
all right, thank you,
restart
Lucy.
rather.
Okay.
So as I was saying about the prices in Malta, they are 9% lower than the European average. And that is because of a decision taken by the Maltese government to subsidize energy and fuel. In fact, when the inflation rate in Malta was 7%, without these subsidies on energy and fuel, the inflation rate would have gone up to 12% or higher than 12% with all the consequences that would have had. Now, in this context, the European Commission and the IMF, they have criticized this economic and, well, I would call it even a social policy of subsidizing the energy and fuel. But without these subsidies, the impact would have been huge, both economically and socially. Now, my argument is quite simple. Without government intervention, the cost of living would have becomes way higher, and that is, in fact, the argument of the government. Governments have stopped intervening to address the issue of the cost of living. Why? Because governments have adopted a liberal policies. Now, in Malta, we like to say that one shouldn't intervene in the market. We leave it to operate. We don't intervene in it. And I think that's one of the best solutions. In fact, I think that's why in other countries the cost of living has risen so much, because the government has not intervened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Willem is the next on my list.
Thank you, Madam President. I will speak in my mother language, Croatian. U nedavnom izvještaju Enrico Letta, more than much.
Thank you. Now, in the letter report that was published recently on markets, Mr. Letta mentioned a new idea that could be possible for EU citizens. And the idea would be new rights. Now, we heard many different things from your presentation, including that some initiatives are not necessary, and this is true in Croatia, namely that there is the huge number of people leaving the country. And is that satisfactory? Many might think that accession to the EU would offer a huge benefit, namely free movement of people, which means that people can leave their countries. Now, in terms of methodology, I'd be interested in the following. Who did you speak to? Who did you interview in your surveys? Because in our country, we saw, well, if you had asked Croatians, the majority would have said that this is a huge problem, this migration. So you could have talked, for example, to teachers who don't have enough students anymore because entire families have left the country. We don't have enough doctors, enough medical assistants, and so on and so forth. I think you would have gotten quite different answers. So I'm not entirely satisfied with what I've heard today, and I don't want to question the credibility of your analysis. But I am quite outraged, I must say, and I'd like to hear from you on this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got last speaker on my list, Maria Hanževačky. If there is still anyone who would like to intervene now, we are going to have still the space, you know, at the later stage of our agenda. So, Maria, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll speak in Croatian. Kolega Ribić je već rekao dio.
Now, my colleague, Mr. Ribić, already said some of the points that I would have mentioned, so I'd like to move in a different direction now. Now, in our country, we had the lowest voter turnout. But what happened in Croatia? Now, the Eurobarometer didn't look at the national situation. Just a couple of months before the EU elections, we had a coalition government, and this was something that happened that was very much put out to the public, and there was a huge issue regarding wages and wages for EU civil servants. And the trust in politicians in our country because of various scandals has been reduced drastically. This has happened throughout the past years, and I'm sure other colleagues have something to say on that, and I think this led to the low voter turnout in Croatia.
Thank you very much for interesting and very diverse questions and comments on the presentation. We have heard, I have heard comments about the governmental interventions to tackle inflation. It was clear that the political responses in the different national contexts are really different and I would say rather unpredictable for the moment. Housing has been mentioned, which is the issue actually for everyone. Drain brain within the EU. I still might add something from your presentation, actually the turnout, which is extremely varying among the different EU countries. So if there is any explanation from your side on this, because the usual suspects are keeping the turnout pretty low. There are others, there are changes throughout the time, so if you could tackle this. And what also was interesting for me, the perception of the impact on daily lives of the people. Actually 26% not realizing this. Is it the lack of information about the EU or about the functioning of the EU or the impacts? So, floor is yours for some 7-8 minutes. I hope you make it. Thank you.
Will do my best. There are many different questions indeed. So first of all, on the methodology of our survey, I guarantee that we have a representative sample of all EU member states. This consists of a sample size of more or less 1,000 per member state, 1,000 respondents, which is representative in order to any scientific and sociological standards for such of a survey. Then the data is weighted on some sociodemographic categories, trying to mirror the actual composition of the countries in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of also regional composition, or in terms of the size of the town. For understanding further, for Mr. Mone, the implications of the cost of living, or if citizens understand what do they understand for this, I would say that first, this is an overarching issue for citizens, and it was even more important for abstainers, as I said before, which are also the ones with a lower level of income. This already giving some important hints on the topic, I think. And then for further explanation, or for a further understanding of what is in citizens' mind, we would need, of course, one study like this has some limitations. This is a quantitative study, so if we would have a qualitative study with focus groups or in-depth interviews, it would be more useful to understand the complex opinions and the complex reasoning of citizens on this regard. But there are also, I must say, there are also some surveys asking specifically for this from the European Commission, so you might want to take a look at that. Then on turnout, in this time went up in many, especially in many of the new member states of the EU in the last enlargements, which is a very good news, because these member states had always the lowest turnouts of the EU actually, and this time these member states were the ones that made the EU turnout stay at the same level. Which otherwise would have decreased, actually. So for me, this is very important. We are still far from what we would like to see in terms of turnout in many countries, as in Croatia, for example. I think one of the possibilities is that they still feel Brussels far from their countries, and there is a way, or there should be an effort that made from here in order to be closer to them and to make them feel that their voice counts in the EU, and also make the debate, because this is always also the problem in many member states. These are in the social science, in political science, these are considered second-order elections. So the national, and as you know, of course, the national context plays a very important role in these elections. although there were some attempts to make a European conversation around the European elections, so with the Spitzenkandidaten, for example, or with some transnational parties that were attempted to be created, and some of them managed to get into the House. But this hasn't been a successful exercise yet. I think we should, in order to increase turnout, specifically in these countries, I think these are three key elements that would be good to take into account, and of course to show that the problems in these countries, but not only, are addressed by the EU institutions. It was very clear, and you saw from the trend line that I presented of the image of the European Union, that EU's response to COVID, for example, was felt by citizens, but that was really clear in all our indicators, that they saw that that the EU was acting and was solving a crisis at that time. So this, I think, it would be a good example of how can the turnout be increased in these countries. Also, I would say that the national politicians should be also in our side in this fight for increasing turnout, because they are not always there. And in terms of also assessing which is the ideology of this issue, this is something that I asked myself, and I think our survey is very good in order to answer this kind of question. But what I saw when analyzing this data is that the cost of living is something that is important for any electorate, first among the voters. So you will find this for almost any national party voters. You will find this as a top priority, and is even more important, as I said, for abstainers. So this is an overarching issue that, in my view, if addressed correctly by the EU, and if citizens, as they felt in the COVID that the EU was acting in order to solve that crisis, they would feel that the EU is impacting on the cost of living and on solving this cost of living crisis. I think they would be more engaged. They would have the EU on a higher regard, and of course they would vote more. So I hope I answered to most, at least, of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess you did, at least from my perspective. So, I mean, this was very, very good quality scene-setting exercise, because we know where we are, we know the perceptions, we are having some explanations of the different decisions of the electorate throughout the elections. So now we're gonna get to the part getting much deeper in the different aspects of the cost of living crisis. And we are gonna start with Agnès PARENT-THIRION, a senior research manager of Eurofound, talking about the impact on working conditions. She's very much actually tied with that, as she is one of the people responsible for organizing the European Working Conditions Survey and its analysis, and also other projects within Eurofound. Agnès is actually online. I hope that the connections would be working, and I would kindly ask all the speakers in this part of our agenda to be able to keep it within 7-8 minutes of their interventions, so that we have some time for questions and answers at the end of this session. So Agnès, you've got the floor.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. Maybe you can start showing my slides. I'm going to give you some results from our European Working Conditions Survey on, this issue of the cost of living and financial security for workers. So, contrary to the Eurobarometer, in this survey we focus on people at work. and I'm going to look at the association with job quality. Next slide. So I'm going to, first of all, give you some information on how we measure financial security, and I'm going to present some results about the outcome, to what extent are workers able to make ends meet with difficulty or without difficulty. And then I'm going to mention look at another dimension, which is important, which is the ability for workers to know how much they're going to earn in the next 3 months. Because it's not only about having enough money, but it's also being able to plan and pay a rent or whatever. Then I'm going to look at the association between work-related earnings and job quality, and we will see that there are some associations, and in particular, a lot of workers with less, earnings, less ability to make ends meet, have a poorer job quality. And then I'm going to show that this is not enough. It also matters on quality of working life. So, for example, work-life balance and health and safety at risk. And then touch the issue mentioned by one of our precedent speakers about the association with labor shortages. So first of all, next slide, we have different indicators to measure financial security. So one is, in the pudding, as I don't remember the exact expression, but basically here what we see is the proportion of workers who report difficulty making ends meet. So at the extreme right, and sorry for this mention, this is the average at the EU level. So what you can see on this slide is that, self-employee with employees report least this, and those who report it the most are workers who are in most atypical, so to say, forms of employment. And, I want to highlight especially the situation of employees without contract and temporary agency workers. Next slide. This slide is about financial security in the sense of ability to predict your earnings. So if you look at what is in purple, it's people who say they are not able to predict their earnings in the next 3 months. And then in blue, it's about 1/4 people who are only able to do it approximately. And what you can see here is this measure of uncertainty is highest, of course, still for workers without contracts and workers on temporary agency work, but also for self-employed. And somehow this is part of the activity. So this is something about the extent, and you can see that it is quite, frequent, both of these phenomenon. Now, next slide, I'm going to touch around the issue of job quality. Just a couple of words. These data are 21, and in 21, we just had the COVID, and we had to move our survey to a different data collection phone, which meant that we had less questions. And we experimented then with one of the OECD quality of the working environment, which is meant to be, which is one of the 3 headlines indicator of the employment strategy. And a second one would be around the quality of earnings. So, let's look at job quality in this context. So the idea of job quality is that you have it's measured at the level of the jobs, because this is where you have a contract between a worker and a company, and it's made of these features of work and employment that have a proven causal relationship, positive or negative, with health and well-being, and this would have been identified by epidemiologic health studies. So you have in work things which are called job demands because they use some of your energy or they create a risk for your health. And then we have another thing which is called job resources. And job resources like training, they allow you to do your work better, so to use less energy to, in a simple way, or they reduce the risk. And what this slide show is that there are many ways to make a job better, many different leverage, and this will be important for the strategy, the action on quality of work in the new Commission. Next slide. So we measure job quality, and then we look at it by the imbalance, so between job demands and job resources. So that's what we call it strained, when workers are more exposed to job demand than job resources, because it means that they're using more of their energy, they're exposed to higher level of risk than they are able somehow to compensate. And we distinguish between different level of a job strain. So there are the red, orange, and yellow. This is where you don't want to be, where you don't want anybody to be in, and against resources which are white and blue. The number 47 refers to the subjective well-being. Subjective well-being goes between 0 and 100, and when you are under 50, you should be tested for mental depression. This is the health indicators. So that shows, somehow that when you are, it's a validation of our index. So when you are in situation of strain, you are really, your well-being, is impacted. What our studies show is that not only that, but actually your all your health indicators, so absence and presenteeism, show the same association. So the better the job, the less absence from work. The better the job, the more engagement, the more trust and cooperation at the workplace. So this is important for democracy. And making ends meet, and work-life balance. These results we found in 21, but they are consistent with what we have found in Eurofound's work on working conditions. Next slide. So here you can, again, so EU 27 every time, again, at the right. So here you can see the association between this highest form of, poorest job quality, so highest strain, and these two indicators about making ends meet and predict earnings. So clearly, same situation. The more you are in a lower job, a lower quality job, the highest both of these features. So less earnings, and that allow you to make ends meet, and a less ability to plan ahead and predict your earnings in the future. Next slide. Let's look now at some exposure to job demands. So as I said, job demands, they increase the risk for your health and well-being. Just two examples, but first one is high-speed work. It's in blue, and it's on the left one, and in orange is tiring position. I've put them two together for two reasons. First of all, because they were quite frequent in all cases, and secondly, because a job which is that you have to do fast and which has physical demands, they will have a synergetic effect. So I think it clearly shows, how adding these things, together is not what you would wish. So you can see that, as you, for workers with experiencing some difficulty ending meet, they are more frequently in a situation where they both have experience both high-speed work and then tiring position. On the right panel, this is a similar situation, but this time with violence. In blue, discrimination in orange, and in green, being in a work which is emotionally disturbing. So you can see the same gradient of, increased access to very demanding job demands. Next slide. So there is one thing: workers in this situation, reporting difficulty making ends meet, experience more demands, job demands in their work. But what about their resources? Are they equally supported as other type of workers? So let's look blue at their access to career prospects, orange training, and green support from colleagues. And what we can see here is that in all cases, workers in the who have more difficulty making ends meet. So in the right hand, they have less access to their job resources. Next slide. In Eurofound, we have found a magic bullet for improving job quality, and that magic bullet, so to say, is what we call high involvement forms of work organization. So high involvement forms of work organization, in our research, the workers in these forms of work organization have a better job quality, and they also have more access to learning, and there's a reduction between the range, between high skilled and low skills in access to skills. So there are 4 forms of a high involvement work organization, but I just wanted to show you 2 of them. So in blue, you are in high discretion and high organizational participation, whereas in orange, you have in this low discretion, low organizational participation. Taylor, we stick to simplify the situation. So what
my apologies, Agnes, no more than 2 minutes. You are pretty over the limit already. It's extremely interesting, but please come to the end. Sorry for that.
Oh, no, that's fine. Sorry about that. So what you can see here, same issues, workers in, experiencing difficulty, are more exposed to forms of organization with low discretion, low organizational participation. It matters also for, their work-life balance and their OSH at risk, same gradient. And just wanted a last point. We're discussing about occupation experiencing labor shortages, and we can see many of those also report, these issues. So key points, the extent financial insecurity of workers in Europe is quite widespread. Contractual status matter, but not only. You have to look at job quality, and workers are exposed to more job demands and less job resources. And we will soon have new and more comprehensive results. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the interruption, but we are still having quite a number of speakers, so that everyone could get her fair share of the time. Thank you very much. Stay with us, because definitely for the questions and answers part of this, we would need you. So now we are coming to Mariëlle FEENSTRA, who would be also online, going deeper into the gender aspects of the energy poverty. So Mariëlle, the floor is yours. Please keep to 8 minutes.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure whether you can see me.
We can hear you, but we cannot see you. But I guess you are also having a PowerPoint, so you can start, and we managed to get your PowerPoint presentation on the screen. Thank you.
Yes, sorry for that. You can't see me, but I'm smiling and waving at you, and thank you for for inviting me and to give my presentation. That is based on a previous that already published report which what's called the gender aspect of the rising cost of living and the impact of the energy crisis, as published by the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee of the European Parliament. Next slide, please. You can find the reports not only in the library, online library of my institute on inclusive energy transition 75 Inc., but I guess it's also available through the normal ways of the reporting publications of the European Parliament. Next slide, please. Can I have that? Yes. So my name is Mariëlle FEENSTRA. I did my thesis on engendering the energy transition in the European Union. I'm a political science researcher, and I'm the co-founder and scientific director of 75 Inc., which is a research institute on gender and energy equality based in the Netherlands, with a community of over 1,200 women working in the energy transition. Next slide, please. So when we are doing our work on gender and energy in the European Union and on energy policy, we take what we call a triple role. We look at the triple role of women in the energy sector. So we're not only looking at who is the energy consumer, which is roughly 50% of the energy consumer is female, but if we look and zoom in into who of the energy consumers are vulnerable for energy poverty or are struggling to pay their energy costs, we would see roughly a percentage of 70% of the female energy consumer struggling to make ends meet. From a producer perspective, so who works in the energy sector, we see a very stable, unfortunately stable, low number of women active working in the energy sector. It's around 20, 24, 25%. But if we look at who is working in technical positions, it's around 10% in the European Union, with the huge differences between the northern European states and the more eastern European member states, where in the eastern part we see a higher involvement of women in STEM functions within the energy sector. If we move to the policymaker's role, like who is involved in energy policy making, who is in the boardrooms of the huge energy companies, we see a high percentage is positioned by men and male workers and male policymakers, and a very low representation of women. So when we move to the next slide, now it describes the three paths of the reports and how we conducted the research through both a desk review of policy documents, both from European Union member states of the European Union themselves, and some knowledge institutions. We also we had some informed focus groups and interviews with key respondents and key actors working on gender and energy and gender and inflation cost. And we divided the report in first the state of play, in which we looked at the impact of the rising cost of living and the energy crisis. Then the second part was on mitigating the rising cost of living and the energy crisis. So how is the policy reactions? And the third one is providing recommendations for actors, both in policy, legal and financial instruments. Next slide, please. So when we look at the rising cost of living and what is the generate impact, we can divide four main dimensions. First of all, an economic dimension. So women have on average a lower income and are disproportionately found as head of households, either as single parent families, or due to the greater longevity than men, living alone at a pensionable age. If we look at the health component, we see that age is, for example, a significant factor in dealing with heat and cold stress when we talk about energy poverty. but also young children and older people being particularly vulnerable to absorb higher cost of living, are faced with poverty elements like not that many options for nutrition, but also energy poverty is definitely an element there. So when we look at energy poverty through a gender lens, we look at the intersectionality of women and the composition of households. We too often see households and as an homogeneous entity, not taking into consideration the fluidity of households, the composition of households, and the fact that there are many households of single parents or women living alone. The affordability is definitely an element that is beyond the energy part. That is, of course, a part of the energy poverty, but it's also about the access to energy choices. Like, for example, not everyone is able to invest the high investment cost for solar panels, heat pumps, or energy efficiency in their homes. And transport and mobility is popping up more and more as an element of energy poverty and is often not included in energy poverty data. So when we move to the next slide, we see that these are numbers from May 2022, that the contribution of energy prices to the consumer price inflation is quite extensively among different member states. We see also that, for example, the impacts of the Ukraine crisis and the choices to reduce the import of cheaper Russian gas, it has an impact on the energy price and has an impact on consumer price inflation. If we move to the next slide, we see that, next slide please. Yes, that there is, if we look at the difficulty for paying utility bills, again, these are a percentage of May 2022. We see that especially single women and single mothers are struggling are struggling to pay their utility bills. These are the responses to the question: how likely or unlikely it is that in the next 3 months your household will have difficulties with the following payments: utility bills like electricity, water, and gas. If we move to the next slide, it's moving on to the second part of the report, namely how can there be policy interventions to mitigate the impacts of high cost and inflation. There are several elements that need to take into consideration. Now we talk about, for example, gender methodology, have gender disaggregated data, not only report on households or consumers, but try to dissect them and understand that there is a difference, whether they're, looking at care responsibilities, looking at age, looking at household composition, that has an impact on how households are able to absorb shocks like a high inflation. It's also about institutional support. Who is there within the governments? Is there a specific committee who feels involved, who feels responsible, and who is monitoring the implementation of policy interventions? Political commitment and legal constitutions, I think that need to be taken as a given, but the financial contribution is often lacking. We see, for example, in the analysis that's around financial contribution, it's often short-term financial compensations without really allocating money for long-term solutions. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the analysis of inflation policies and how there are different interventions within European member states on mitigating the impacts and smoothing the impacts of inflation. The EU Policy Watch sees an increase of policy interventions on mitigating energy poverty or increasing income in general, with some elements on compensation, for example, for workers or vulnerable groups of citizens. However, when analyzed, we see that the policy responses to rising inflation in member states, we found that most policy responses reported in this EU Policy Watch database are temporary and ad hoc, lacking a permanent structure. Also, unlike initial pandemic responses, social partners have played a lesser role in designing the measures to mitigate inflation. A third dimension is that we see one-off lump sum payments are more prevalent than monthly support, with policies directed towards the general population or specific groups, often excluding higher income individuals. And furthermore, we saw that governments predominantly resort to tax cuts or credits to influence prices, with fewer employing subsidies or price controls. And the last conclusion we draw from this policy analysis is that measures aimed at vulnerable groups tend to offer financial support for individual choices, while non-targeted actions primarily addresses energy bills and fuel prices. Because now, when we move to the next slide,
my apologies, Mariëlle. 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, I'm almost at the end. So the how to overcome this is, on the long term, is of course that something that resonates with your committee is ensure that there's a strong human capital agenda, that people are getting sustainable, safe, and well paid and well cared of jobs. And what we especially see in women involved in, for example, in the job market, is that they need to be stimulated. It's not only as starters, they need to be supported, but also for them to stay within the job markets, finding ways to facilitate switchers, people that move from one sector to the other, and to have gender disaggregated data again. The final slide moves me to the policy recommendations, which says, from a gender perspective, place equality at the core of action, enable policy at all levels, enforce a long, steady legal framework, but also support it with financial support to secure livelihood, and facilitate cross-sector coordinations by breaking the silos, collaborate with multi-actors, and especially involve social partners and local actors collaboration. I thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Also to very concrete recommendations. I mean, that's for us in the afternoon going to be a very good starting point. Without any further delay, we are moving to Jan Willems, EPSU General Secretary. I mean, very well-known advocating for good quality public services, being one of the means to improve equality, fairness, environmental sustainability, and very much advocating for the rights for consultation, information, and involvement. So your 8 minutes, Jan Willems.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Always a pleasure to be at the workers group and say a few words on our perspective to you. I'm a bit distracted, I must say, and apologize for that. As I was mentioning to Lucie and also Oliver this morning, some of our trade union colleagues have been arrested in Turkey from the confederations DISC and KES, including one of our executive committee members of GANZLEBEN, one of the municipal service unions. So I've been a bit trying to coordinate how we can react. So I am a bit distracted. We'll also leave earlier to go back to the office for some work related to this. Also, I see Thomas is not here. Otherwise, I would have said solidarity. So his nameplate is in front of me, so I'm addressing his nameplate. Solidarity to Thomas, his members and of one of the other public sector unions are on the streets in Vienna arguing for supporting their demands for a new collective agreement which takes into account also the cost of inflation and seeking a higher outcome. And I'll come back to that briefly. I think we have already touched upon the fact that inflation is touching and rising cost of living are important to workers, to households, and of course that also means it has an impact on public services. If we look at inflation, obviously we also look at the cost of inflation. A couple of things have been mentioned with regard to that. I think some of you will be aware of the research of Isabella Weber, who argues that one of the reasons for the recent spike and the recent high spike in the cost of living, the increase in inflation, has also been due to market concentration of market power by corporations and allow them to drive up prices, as he describes that as a seller's market. What I would argue is that behind that, of course, has been the neoliberal ideology, on the one hand reducing the role of the states, weakening the role of the states to actually intervene, on the other, for example, through privatization and deregulation, on the other hand, the neoliberal ideology to use the state to also create markets and with that commodify, amongst others, public services, but also using the state to protect the interests of corporations, corporate power and the rich. And my main argument is that this takes away a stabilizing role public services can play in a cost of living crisis, and including public companies, and maybe I should say publicly owned companies. Isabella Weber, in a more recent analysis, goes into deeper in this argument, also relating it to her analysis of the US elections. I will skip that. Suffice it to say that I think we all are aware, and it has already been raised by many in the discussion, the cost of living crisis also had an impact on the housing crisis, which is apparent in many countries. It generated windfall profits for companies, made things worse for low-income households, and also increased the cost of investment. The customary reaction would be to raise the interest rates by central banks, and that actually made the situation, I think, worse. Isabella Weber has also done an analysis for the European Parliament, for the Economic Committee, in which he makes this argument. And I think the research of both the E2C and the European Trade Union Institute link with that as well. In terms of real wages, I think we're all aware, because of the time lag, that many workers actually lost purchasing power. The ETY, in its benchmarking report for this year, even saw that continue. Average in the European Union, there was still a loss of 0.7% on average, but with big disparities, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Italy actually continue to see a loss of purchasing power. Her reaction is that rather than a knee-jerk reaction to raise interest rates, is that we need to address the concentration of power. I want to go back to to my main argument that public services are not only the backbone of equitable societies, but also that they help us to actually address inflation. But of course, public services themselves are also touched by rising costs and inflation. The purchasing power of your public budgets to finance education, health, other expenditure, investment also, is also eroded. To give you an example, which was in the news this week, maybe our Belgian colleagues will have picked that up, it also, because of privatization and outsourcing of certain services, for example, elderly care, elderly care companies have seen also their energy costs rising, and that led also, and because most of their funding comes from the public sector still, and the public sector didn't increase the budget. Because those companies wanted to maintain their profit margins, some of those companies also went broke or reduced workforce, and that's the example of this week here in Belgium, where 8 elderly care homes will be closed with 150 jobs which will disappear. We also argue that the austerity policies make this situation worse, because it also restricts the scope there is for growth in public budgets. And I think, as our colleague Palmieri mentioned earlier, there's also a big impact with regard to regional development, which we see in the European Union, and that has a big impact as well. For public service workers, obviously, like with all workers, there's been an impact on their salaries. And I think we have seen the last month or two a big mobilization in Europe, which will continue on the 29th of September. 29th of November, there's the general strike of CGL and Wheel in Italy, and it is about budgets, public budgets, it is about public sector wages, it is about investment in health and to have more funding for that. On the 5th of December, our French colleagues in the public sector will be on the streets, and there have been many actions, in particular in health and care, throughout Europe over the last month or two. I'm not going to give all the examples, but I think it also shows that collective bargaining, and including for public service workers, remains a key issue to defend our salaries, of course. So public services are important to stabilize the economic situation. I would argue that because public services offer also access to health, elderly care, childcare in most countries, and not in all countries are those services publicly provided, education, etc. They not only are there to realize those fundamental rights, but they also help to reduce, how do you call it, out-of-pocket expenditure for many households. And of course that translates also in making housing, if you have more investment of the public sector, more publicly run housing, that makes also for more affordable housing programs, etc. Another factor for the public sector, seen as the welfare state, are the employment protection programs. One of the things sure during COVID, one of the things we're trying to also prolong in the current, we're arguing in the EGC to prolong that in the current context, helping to also provide job stability. So government intervention, public stability, I would argue stability also which can be provided by publicly owned companies. If you make those companies more responding to the market, you have more of a problem when you have a crisis as we are seeing and have seen. And of course collective bargaining. I was struck by the finding of the Eurobarometer results, which said that if you have big problems paying your bills, or are more impacted by inflation. In the results it was working class and lower middle income class higher. They are less likely to vote. I think somebody else referred to they're more how do you say, recently more also open to vote for the right and especially extreme right parties. I would also make the argument that public services, by removing and commodifying public services, also a mechanism to help and protect those workers and households has been removed. And of course that's added by, if you outsource certain services, catering, cleaning, etc., of public services. Often they are less stable jobs and often also not covered by a collective agreement. So we think it is important for governments to maintain their public services, to maintain their welfare state. Of course, in the current context, what we think with austerity and the renewed austerity, this is made more difficult, which will also lead to a cutback again in public investment. We are already seeing that the austerity programs lead to a cutback in public investment, making the situation again, especially for low-income households, worse. Of course, we as trade unions, and I will end with that, have an important role to play in defending our welfare state, defending public services. I would argue also public ownership to provide stability for us, for society. And we will need that also in the upcoming debates we will have in the European Union, where we see a lot of, where we see an absence of attention for public services. Think of the Clean Industrial Act. Think of the discussion on housing, where at European level there's little attention for public services, whereas we would argue they are especially crucial in those circumstances, in those policies as well. So an important role for public services to function as a mechanism to address also the cost of living crisis. If you address public services, reduce their role in society, we are also less capable of addressing cost of living crisis like we are experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Very clear message, as we are used to with you. Thanks for that. Without any further delay, we move to Sina RIZ À PORTA. Welcome, board member of the European Youth Forum, so that very necessary youth perspective. We know that you are very much also advocating and fighting for the housing issue and access to housing, especially for young people. So the 8 minutes for you, Sina.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me. As we've already heard a couple of times today, in June's elections, rising living costs and the economic situation were the top issues driving Europeans to vote. The cost of living crisis is particularly felt by young people, with 40% of young people in the EU currently finding it difficult or very difficult to make ends meet. Today, I will go into what is causing this financial strain and the impact the cost of living crisis has on young people, before leaving you with a couple of key recommendations to go forward in tackling this very important issue. So, what reasons can we see for this financial strain? For many young people, the expectation that work should provide a decent standard of living feels increasingly disconnected from reality. The rate of in-work poverty among young people has surged to a record high of 12.5%, which is significantly higher than that of the general population. Wages have largely stagnated for young people, failing to keep up with the rising cost of living, which pushes more young people into financial strain. And at the same time, wages are not only low, but often accompanied by precarious working conditions. Young people face fluctuating working hours and unpredictable schedules with limited stability or consistency from one week to the next. Simultaneously, young people are often excluded from social security benefits or receive reduced support due to limited work contributions stemming from such irregular or precarious employment. In addition, housing costs have indeed become an overwhelming burden. Rents have risen by 23% in the past decade, with many young people now paying more than 40% of their income for rent. With these accumulating pressures, it's no surprise that nearly 1 in 4 young people across the EU are now at risk of poverty or social exclusion. The financial strain that comes with the cost of living crisis has a profound impact on young people's lives. Sorry for going too fast. I will slow down. First of all, financial strain is a major contributor to chronic stress among young people who constantly worry about meeting their basic needs. Unpredictable work hours, the inability to cover living expenses, and concerns about job security all work in tandem to drive up anxiety levels among young adults. Young people are 5% more likely than the general population to be unable to cover unexpected costs, creating additional anxiety and uncertainty. With limited prospects for economic stability, many young people feel that the traditional milestones of adulthood, such as financial independence or leaving the parental home, are increasingly out of reach. In addition to the stress of making ends meet, this lack of autonomy can fuel a sense of disillusionment among young people, and one area where we can see the impact of this is youth voter turnout. Financial difficulties can also lead young people to isolate themselves from friends and social relations, often because they can't afford to participate in social activities due to lack of funds. At the same time, constant financial strain can lead young people to make decisions based solely on immediate financial need, rather than personal or career growth. This environment of survival mode affects their confidence and motivation, often leading to job dissatisfaction and burnout. In short, the lack of time and time autonomy that comes with precarious working conditions and the inability to afford a decent living also means that young people lack the time to pursue growth opportunities. At this point, let me give my personal example. I am currently serving a 2-year mandate as a board member of the European Youth Forum, a position which, among many other things, offers immense opportunity for learning and growth, and which I'm sure will have a profound impact on my further development and open many doors for me. However, this is a volunteer position. The only reason that I am able to make time to take up this civic engagement and benefit from the growth opportunities that come with it is that my living is secured for me by someone else. And that is a huge privilege that most people simply don't have when they're young. All in all, this is to say that financial strain not only affects young people's present well-being, but also shapes their future outlook, leaving many feeling trapped in a cycle of limited opportunities. This ongoing stress can impact their mental and physical health, leading to issues such as anxiety, depression, and even chronic health problems over time. So, what's to be done? Of course, this is a very, very multidimensional issue, but today I'd like to focus on 4 key demands, which I think apply not only to the EU, but also the local level. First of all, the minimum wage must be replaced with a living wage. The minimum wage rate in multiple European countries falls far below what is necessary to provide a decent standard of living. Based on recent Eurofound research, living wages across Europe would typically range from 17% to 80% higher than current minimum wages, depending on the member state. We need to extend a living wage to all workers, irrespective of contractual status, amount of time in the job, age, or other discriminatory criteria. This also, and in particular, includes the eradication of youth wages. Youth wages effectively mean that young people can be paid less for the same work simply because they're young, and should therefore be immediately replaced with full normal wages for all. Secondly, we need a social welfare system that works for young people. It is crucial that social welfare supports and services are equipped to deal with the insecurity and uncertainty precarious young workers face. There needs to be adequate income support in place for those in precarious work, which is readily available and free from lengthy administrative burdens. It should also be indexed to the cost of living to maintain adequacy. Right now, there are still areas where age criteria exclude young people from accessing, for example, unemployment benefits. This practice should be immediately ended to ensure that income can be topped up when needed for everyone. Third, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this here, we need trade unions. They are crucial in helping young people manage the cost of living crisis by pushing for fair wages, secure contracts, and better working conditions. However, restrictive regulations across Europe limit union efforts, especially in organizing precarious work, where many young people are employed. Legislation is needed to guarantee union recognition, access to workplaces for unions, and the right to collective bargaining for all workers. In short, we need to actively combat anti-union efforts to ensure that every young and older person, especially those working precarious jobs, have access to collective bargaining as a meaningful tool to improve their working conditions. Finally, and you have mentioned it, the housing affordability crisis needs to be addressed head-on. This is especially crucial for young people for the reasons I've already mentioned, the relative stagnation of young people's wages, and the importance of housing in achieving emancipation. That is why social and affordable housing should be drastically increased in every member state, while also making sure that rental markets are fair and in line with the cost of living. That brings me to the end of my remarks for today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sina. That was also an extremely clear message to all of us. Happy to have you here on board and happy to make the link also with the trade unions and the collective bargaining actually for all. Now we are moving to the sustainable transitions. We are moving to Catherine GANZLEBEN, the head of Group of Enabling Systems Change at the European Environmental Agency. Her work concerns support and design of EU sustainability policies and the impact of green transition on society. Definitely very interesting link with the poorer regions facing more difficulties and so on. So Catherine, for 8 minutes, the floor is yours. We are looking forward.
Super, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us. I hope that we can bring a slightly different perspective in terms of our work around environment and sustainability. So at the European Environment Agency, we look at sustainability transitions, the changes that we need to make in our society, but also our economy in order to achieve sustainability. If I can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we talk about the changes that are required to our key systems, and thereby we mean our industrial systems, our energy systems, our food systems, and the changes that we need to make are profound. They will impact on people's jobs and people's livelihoods. If you can go to the next slide, please. And so what we've seen indeed recently in the EU is that these impacts on people's livelihoods create a political backlash. And we saw that very clearly with the farmer protests most recently this summer in Brussels, where farmers protested against EU policies and specifically focused on climate and environment policies linked to concerns around their livelihoods and the cost of living that they face, and indeed the cost specifically of energy inputs to their work. Next, please. And we see, of course, that these winners and losers in these sustainability transitions, it's not just within European borders, it's also a global context. We see that particularly in terms of the impacts of climate change, we see those playing out within Europe, but also beyond European borders. And the tensions that we see now emerging around trade, of course, also have implications for people living outside of the European Union. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of EU action to address the issue of justice within transitions, we have within the EU the Just Transition Fund with large funds distributed under cohesion policy to support specifically those territories that are affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. And the member states put in place territorial just transition plans in order to address those changes. And that includes, for example, efforts to reskill workers who lose their jobs from fossil fuels industries, in order that they might find future employment. We also, importantly, at EU level, have the Social Climate Fund, which is to be introduced in the coming years. And this is specifically aimed at addressing some of the effects of the ETS2 scheme, the emission trading scheme, and the impact that that will have on people's cost of living. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we've done some work at the agency looking at how these transitions affect what we call essential services poverty. This is people's ability to pay for essential services. And we're looking specifically at energy, transport, and water and sanitation. So if we just look at what these transitions may imply, in terms of the energy transition, we have seen that the shift to renewables has the potential to both reduce and stabilize energy prices, specifically reducing our dependency on imported energy and potentially creating savings for households through prosumerism, which is where households become energy producers through, for example, having solar panels or heat pumps. In terms of transport, we see the potential for a cleaner and more sustainable and efficient mobility systems, specifically where we have investments in public transport, where we really then focus on accessibility and affordability for all citizens. Whilst in the area of water and sanitation, if we do have improvements in water pricing, then this can lead to a better adherence to the polluter pays principle, where the polluters of water are fined for polluting and therefore pay the cost of their own pollution. But we also see that these changes, these big transitions, do have implications for affordability and accessibility. If we can just go to the next slide. So focusing on the emission trading scheme, what we see there is that we do expect the ETS2, which will put a carbon price on both buildings and road transport, to significantly increase costs. So we do see that in some countries, the cost of natural gas will increase in Hungary and Latvia, for example, by up to 37%. And there are, of course, concerns, because what we see is that the lowest income households will spend above the 10% energy poverty threshold on their energy. And those households, as we've discussed, as the other speakers have mentioned, are already paying a higher share of their income on energy. And they're often more reliant on fossil fuels and less able to, for example, invest in solar panels or heat pumps because of the exorbitant cost. So what we see is that coupled with the ETS2, we need to have targeted redistribution measures, whereby we create measures to mitigate these adverse effects, enabling the poorest households to access alternative technologies and reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. And this is what's foreseen with the Social Climate Fund, and we await the choices that the member states take there. To the next slide, please. So we have recently done some work looking at what we call household essential services poverty. And we define this as a household that spends more than 23% of their disposable income on energy, transport, and water and sanitation combined. And what this graph shows you is the percentage of income spent on energy, transport, and water and sanitation by households in the poorest 10% by income. And this data is from 2020. So what you can see is on the left, we have countries like Croatia, which has already been mentioned this morning, where more than 25% are in that category, and essentially in a context of essential services poverty. And that represents across Europe 21 million households and 6.2% of the population. And what we see is that energy poverty is the most significant driver of household essential services poverty. And indeed that the poorest households spend a higher proportion of their income on essential services. The link to this information is in a report there. You can see Milieu 2020. So if you're interested in digging into the data, I encourage you to have a look. Next slide, please. And just to mention that in the EU, there are a number of policies in place specifically to address energy poverty. I think there's been over the past, under the European Green Deal, significant recognition of energy poverty as an issue. And in the Fit for 55 package, we have a number of revised directives aiming to address that, specifically looking at promoting renewable energy, but also enabling renovation so that people can increase the energy efficiency of their homes through renovation. The policy package is to take effect over the next few years, so we wait to see the impacts there. Next slide, please. And just to conclude, we recently did a report looking at justice in the context of transitions and really understanding what can be done. And what we see is that there's a real need to look at systems, not just one part of the system, but when we look at energy, to look at the whole system and how the costs and benefits of change towards a clean energy system are distributed across society. It's also crucial to look at the local context and the conditions that people have at the local level, and indeed to invest in both capacity building and effective governance. And finally, what we see is these processes of transition include both phase out, so closing down fossil fuel industries, and then thereby creating job losses and affecting communities, and those sides have to be addressed. But we also see a build-up, right? We see now this plan for a clean industrial deal and job creation and green jobs. And when we build up a new system, we also have to ensure that that system is creating equal opportunities for people across society and not just for elites. Next slide, and here I conclude. You can see some of this information in a recent report that we published, and I would encourage you to take a look. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I mean, it's really striking to see some of the statistics, but I'm happy actually that some of the political responses you have mentioned are something which needs to be taken at the forefront. I mean, in a way, I for the first time have heard the essential services poverty formulation, but I mean, its increase, but also the need to go to redistributive policies and measures are one of the keys in the mix of the different arrangements and measures that needs to be taken actually at all the levels. So thanks for that, and we are coming to Ursula TILL-TENTSCHERT, Doctor of Sociology and Senior Statistician at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, specializing in topics of poverty, discrimination, indicator development, social reporting, and welfare state policies. So we are really very interested to learn about the impact of cost of living crisis on fundamental rights. So Ursula, for 8 minutes, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I will present the results of this year's Fundamental Rights report. Next slide, please. The FRA publishes such annual report which provides a barometer of the fundamental rights situation in the EU and its member states and collects data on the ground on the developments in the member states. The research period was 2023 and also going a bit further back, and one of the chapters was the impact of the cost of living crisis and rising poverty on fundamental rights. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, in the consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the energy crisis following the Russian war of aggression against the Ukraine, prices have been rising significantly, whereas on average, the prices increased around 9% between 21 and 22 for key commodities such as housing, water, energy, transport, food and non-alcoholic beverages. These were much higher, 18% for housing, water and energy and 12% for the others. In 2023, almost half of the household's expenditures was on those three commodities, and therefore the impact was much stronger as the average inflation rate would suggest. Next slide, please. Our research shows that the EU and the member states have actually responded very fast with various legislative and policy measures to the crisis, which can be clustered around three areas of intervention: in tackling energy poverty, in supporting adequate and affordable housing, and in social protection and inclusion, where these immediate measures were effective. For example, poverty and social exclusion has not increased in these years. However, we encountered significant gaps in the implementation. A lot of the measures were only temporary and not targeted, and therefore did not reach some of the most vulnerable households affected by the cost of living crisis. Next slide, please. We have seen that many fundamental rights were impacted. There was a sharp increase in energy poverty between 2021 and 2022, from 7 to 9%, and actually in 23 it increased further to over 10%. There was an increase in child poverty since 2019 by 1 million children more at risk of poverty and social exclusion. And we also saw an increase in housing costs and housing cost burden and arrears in payments. But also the service providers were impacted by this increase of prices. They were facing not only an increase in the number of clients, of users, but also facing higher energy bills themselves, and which resulted actually in service limitation due to that. And also we can see that those in vulnerable situations, single parent households, Roma, travelers, immigrants, persons with disabilities are clearly more at risk. And we also saw that there was a lack of data. When there was data, there was no disaggregation for different groups, and a lack of impact assessments of the measures taken. And we can conclude that the impact of this crisis was not borne equally. We have seen enough also examples today. Just one example from our data. Next slide, please. So energy poverty can be measured through the inability to keep home adequately warm. If we look at different data collected from different FRA surveys on hard-to-reach populations, which are usually not shown in the statistics you can see that immigrant and descendants of immigrants, as well as Roma and traveller, have a considerable higher risk of experiencing energy poverty than the average in the EU 27. So this is, for example, 15% for Roma and travellers, 21% for Roma in Eastern European countries, and 31% among immigrants from Syria, in comparison to 9% on average across the EU. Also above average are immigrants and descendants immigrants from North African countries and from sub-Saharan African countries. It was mentioned already that energy poverty is tackled in the revised EU Energy Efficiency Directive and the Social Climate Fund regulation, which is clear progress, but we can see that the data we have are clearly limited when it comes to specific groups, particularly vulnerable. Thank you. Next slide. The EU and the member states have an obligation to protect the fundamental rights, which are enshrined, first of all, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Different rights are impacted by the consequences of the crisis, which is the Article 21 on non-discrimination. Any discrimination based on any grounds such as sex, race, color, ethnic or social origin, genetic features, language, religion, belief, age, disability, sexual orientation shall be prohibited. Also important is, of course, Article 23 on equality between women and men, Article 24 and 25, which establishes the right of the child to be protected and for the older persons to live a life of dignity and independence, and Article 26, which establishes the right of persons with disabilities to benefit from measures designed to ensure their independent social and occupational integration and participation in the life. Then Article 34 establishes a right to social security and social assistance, including housing assistance, in order to combat social exclusion and poverty. And then Article 36, very important, access to services of general economic interest. Then, of course, the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights and the implementing strategies and legislation, including the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, EU Roma Strategic Framework, and many more. Also important when there is a horizontal enabling condition on the effective application and implementation of the Fundamental Rights Charter and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability when implementing and the EU funds. And then member states are obliged to have obligations under the European Social Charter and the UN development goals and other international treaties and instruments. Next slide, please. As I said, there were many measures which were effective to first combat energy poverty, the taxation, price caps, direct subsidies to households. However, there was often a lack of clear objectives, targets, and assessments of how vulnerable households can be reached. Next slide, please. When it comes to affordable housing, there were effective and also promising practices in the area of energy saving interventions, housing benefits, tax credits, regulating rental prices, and protecting tenants from evictions. But the shortfall was that there were often...
Perhaps we could ask the speaker to move away a little bit from the microphone. She's got something rubbing against the microphone. It's really disturbing.
To combat poverty and support social protection. One of the most important measures were the indexation of salaries and social benefits. But also there were direct subsidies and benefits in kind, such as a warm meal in schools. And what we could see also that in many countries, there were within this landscape of measures, there were also significant gaps in policy, such as the lack of policy and financial resources to tackle the cost of living crisis. For example, whereas in some countries there was an indexation of social transfers, in other countries there was no indexation or even cutting in social transfers. So let me summarize. Next slide, please. What we saw was a lack of thorough assessment of the actual impacts of the cost of living crisis on fundamental rights as protected by the Charter. That policy and legal measures should be evidence-based using an ex-ante fundamental rights assessment. We also saw that human rights bodies did receive complaints about lack of income, food, and adequate housing, and should be supported in their role in this regard. And there is a clear need of robust and reliable data which are sufficiently disaggregated to determine their potential impact on fundamental rights.
There is a problem with the Hungarian translation because of the backside noise. So can you please ask the presenter to stop this backside noise?
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Ursula, there is something with your microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well, but it's sounds better, so try to continue like this. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry for that. I didn't have any problems in the test. I'm on the last slide. So there is the need of robust and reliable data sufficiently disaggregated to determine the potential on fundamental rights, particularly on persons in vulnerable situations among women, children, young people, ethnic minorities, older people, LGBTIQ, Roma and travelers, and people with disabilities. So there is a need to mainstream and look into the specific situation of these households, to set up a fundamental rights monitoring and to ensure the effective monitoring when applying EU funds. This is also in relation to the green transition we heard before and the climate targets when it comes to energy poverty, to take fundamental rights into account in all measures, in particular when developing and implementing the revised energy and national energy and climate plans and the upcoming social climate fund plans, to take fundamental rights explicitly into account and all these groups and to look into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ursula, also to you. I mean, I'm extremely happy that all the speakers came up with the description of the problem, with the different perception for the different areas of the cost of living crisis, but also with some proposed measures, which are either in force and implemented partially in some of the environments or just proposals, because it gives us really very rich variety of the tools. We should be discussing actually in the afternoon how to use them in the best way in our work here in the committee. But before still giving the floor to the last speaker of this morning, which is Francesco Saraceno, who should come with a mix of policy measures and recommendations. We are having space for some reflections, some questions, clarification questions still now, because, I mean, it was really very rich input into our debate, so we should have this chance. I can see Claude, I can see Cinzia, I can see Florian. I can see Marco. Okay, we are still gonna have, you know, our chance in the afternoon in the deep debate for our internal reflection. But definitely, we are starting with Claude, and then we continue with Cinzia. Try to restrain to 3 minutes, please.
Merci, Présidente. Je voudrais donner un...
Thank you. First, I had an information point. And then after listening to Jan Willem's presentation, I wanted to say that in Belgium, in the Francophone area, we have had a strike, a teacher strike, which was the result of our new center-right government. Now, I would like to thank all of the speakers. I think it really gives a whole panoply of perspectives that's quite interesting on the topic. Now, in Belgium, as you know, we have automatic indexation of salaries, which is a very important system, and it allows us to more or less maintain purchasing power of those who are salaried workers. And it also allows us to have some economic stability, which is considerable, even though for certain types of businesses that are more oriented towards external markets, this could perhaps impact their competitiveness. Now, this is a system that has been called into question. It's nothing new. The automatic indexation system. The second thing I wanted to say was on the difference between the realities of rising costs of living and perception. And it's a difficulty that we have, for example, with the automatic indexation of salaries. Not all employees realize how impactful it is. Sometimes reality is quite different from perceptions. Now, I am thinking of housing, healthcare, food costs, access to public services as well. All of this, I think, ties into fundamental rights. Now, in terms of the far right and its rise, I think we should not be explaining this, we should not be painting this in broad strokes. There is a socioeconomic part, of course, but it's not the only factor. For example, in Belgium, we have the north and the south. The north, Flanders, which is economically booming. And nonetheless, it's a region where the far right, unfortunately, is doing quite well. And then if you look at the Francophone region in Wallonia, where we do have socioeconomic problems that are much more considerable than in the north, there's almost no presence of the far right. So I think we need a more complex view of the subject. And I think one important factor, not the only one, is the reality faced by companies. There is a link between democracy and the good functioning of businesses. When employees are living in constant precarity, they cannot be democratic. They cannot vote in a democratic way or act democratically. And when we have a certain form of dictatorship in the sense that workers don't have a say in how their work is organized, well, in those situations, we can't speak about democratic citizens. So the important thing to keep in mind is to have more democratic workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting the different issues apart from the democracy at work, the Belgium indexation system. We all would need it and appreciate it. Cinzia is the next speaker.
I will speak in Italian. Riprendo dove ha lasciato.
Let me pick up where Claude left off. What I noticed in the presentation from Eurofound is that there seems to be a natural shift because of the swift changes in the workplace, where the work contract is increasingly of a private nature and is not covered by collective bargaining agreements, but the work relationship is being privatized and individualized. So each and every worker has to negotiate his or her own working conditions. And for youth, for young persons, this becomes even more problematic. They face a lot of problems. They're expected to have flexible work relationships, and a young person then finds him or herself having to negotiate their working conditions. Now, I suppose there is an upside. There's flexibility. They can reconcile private and working life. So it's presented as an advantage to workers. But, of course, there is an impact on us as trade unions and the way in which we are organized. We need to make sure that these people are interested in becoming a member of a trade union. We need to make sure that these contracts are properly drafted, that they abide by the rules of equal opportunities and equal treatment. And as Jan Willem was saying, when it comes to services, it's as if everyone is left to their own devices. They're on their own. Now, in Italy, we've had a report where 4.5 million persons don't have access to healthcare. They simply don't have access, in particular, to preventive treatment. And what I noticed in the Eurofound presentation, and I'll speak frankly here, is that not enough is made of how important bargaining is and why there is no call for the immediate introduction and implementation of the legislation on minimum wage. Now, when the German government says that they're fine with the transposition of the directive and they don't need any more than that, when the coverage under collective bargaining in Germany is below 80%, then I'm starting to get worried, because how about all the other countries then? So all of the European institutions, and our colleague from the Parliament has now left, but all of the European institutions need to make sure that there is effective implementation of the directive and also of all of the other instruments that are out there. When it comes to salaries, we don't have automatic indexation in Italy. This is done through collective bargaining, and of course there is a discrepancy. If no contract is entered into, then you have a problem. But I would underscore what Jan Willem said about services. Access to services is becoming increasingly problematic for a lot of our citizens. We simply don't have sufficient resources for that access to be granted, because it's not free of charge, of course. So that's a real problem, and you can't cover that or make up for it simply through a contract. That's not enough.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Florian, you've got the floor. 3 minutes max. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear President. Well, I have some remarks to make. Perhaps you will ask me why I have this voice. I have this voice because this weekend we had elections, and I tried as much as I could to defend democracy. I failed. I failed because one of the main reasons in which because due to the fact that I failed, it was the cost of living. It was one of the most powerful motivation for voting massively a far-right candidate which came from nowhere. So this is a serious issue. From my point of view, and this was not approached during this discussion, the cost of living in relation with propaganda. Because what I'm seeing right now, especially in some member states, and I'm discussing about my home country, Romania, well, the fact that you cannot afford to eat meat properly in a month, it is a problem. The fact that we are discussing right now about delivering hot meals for children in the rural areas. Come on, we are that low. We are that in some rural areas in Romania, people are not going to school, children, because they don't have what to wear. They are going to school only to receive that meal. We are that low. We are that low. So this is why I have this voice. Now, the relation with the public services, because it has been mentioned. In 2011, for promoting the efficiency of the public expenditure, they have closed hospitals, they have closed schools in the rural areas. So I think that we need to tackle also the approach between the efficiency of the public expenditure and the public role of the public services. Because you cannot close schools because you need to be more efficient. What we have done, we have saw that in 5 years, a lot of social problems we have saw in those communities. So I think that this relation between the quality of public services and efficiency should be more explored. Then the relation, the structure of the expenditure of a household. I can give you an example. In Romania, half of the social assistance budget is going to subvention of energy. for household. The idea of what I am saying here is that people or household cannot afford to have a heated household. And this is one of the most used argument in the accession of the far right, saying that we didn't want to liberalize the energy market. Brussels did. And if Brussels wants to have a liberal energy market, well, we don't want to. We want to give you energy, but we are not guilty of anything. What I'm trying to say is that we need another narrative. And we need to discuss really clear about the role of the market. Because right now, everything what we are promoting in Brussels is coming against us at the national level. So for me, again, I have yelled, because I'm talking also loud, but I have yelled 2 days in a row until I lost my voice, in order to make them understand that this is not true. We need a narrative. We need to work on a common narrative.
Your time is up.
I will finish right now.
Your time is up.
The problem of poverty.
Your time is up. We come to it in the afternoon.
2 minutes, 2 minutes. The problem of poverty. We are investing.
In the afternoon. Sorry.
No, just to
really, you are already for 5 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
We get to it in the afternoon, I promise.
Okay.
Don't worry. I've got still Marco and Franca on my list.
Thank you very much, Lucie. Je parlerai en français.
I will speak in French. Now, I am from a country that also has salary indexation. And beyond what Claude said about the advantages of this type of indexation for employees, I would like to say that there is another effect. There is a moderating effect. Because the governments have a sort of shield when it comes to energy costs in order to limit the increase of inflation. That's how it happens in Luxembourg, for example. There are certain costs of public services that increase less because of the indexation. Now, some say that indexation would increase inflation, but I would like to draw your attention to this moderating effect, this mitigating effect of indexation on the cost of public services, first and foremost. And another comment that was mentioned, a comment made by one of the speakers, was on the quality of public services. That's very important as well, not just the prices, but also access to public services. And I think it was during the Eurobarometer presentation, the issue of access to quality public services was not addressed. And quality, I think, is very, very crucial. It goes back to austerity measures, to lack of public services. And I think this is feeding into higher voter turnout for the extreme right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco and Franca. Last speaker for the moment.
Oui. Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you. Now, I do fully agree with Claude and the other speaker. I would like to have a more complex take on this issue. We need realistic analyses in order to act. Now, I'd like to say that nobody drew any sort of connection between education levels and voting for the far right. In the US, in France, we saw that the higher the education level, the lower the voter turnout for the far right. So I think we need to nuance our analysis, because otherwise we won't be looking at all of the factors involved. And then, of course, we have to mention the difference between reality and perception. And last but not least, the elections that we saw in Romania, well, there was propaganda involved, fake news. And this too goes back to communication, to lack of fact-checking, and these things have an impact on voting. When Mexicans, for instance, vote for Trump when he would like to throw them out of the country, well, where's the logic there? And perhaps this ties back to education, to the fact that people don't realize they're being manipulated. And this type of manipulation needs to be fought against. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for all the inputs. Very nice elements and very important elements being highlighted. Actually, due to the time which is really running, I wouldn't give the floor to the panelists for the moment to reflect on this. For those who are able to stay with us, let's hope to have a moment for this after the last presentation we should go through. Now by Francesco Saraceno, who is the Deputy Department Director at the French Observatory of Economic Cycles, a think tank hosted by Sciences Po. His main area of interest concerns the relationship between macroeconomics policies and societal inequalities. Francesco, if we manage to get your presentation to 30 minutes, it would be really brilliant because we really would like to have some time for reflection. So the floor is yours. Lovely. You can start talking, Francesco. Welcome.
Francesco, your microphone seems to be closed. We cannot hear you anything. We can see the presentation, but that's all.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now
okay.
we hear you perfectly fine.
Thank you. So let me reshare the presentation. I apologize. So I was saying that I'm glad you gave me 30 minutes because I was expecting 20, and I was expecting to overtime with respect to the 20. So now I should be fine. So let me look for the presentation to share. I have it here. I don't seem to be able to. Hold on. Okay, now you should see it, right?
Yep, we see you and hear you.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I only could assist. I had class this morning, so I only connected a bit late. So I just assisted to a few of the intervention and the speeches that followed. And then I also listened with lots of interest to the remarks from the floor. And actually, it's going to help me because one of the things I wanted to touch upon was exactly this problem of the different impact of inflation on different social groups, and so on the risk that we have today for the social contract. I mean, I think the interventions that preceded really made it very clear. So what I would like to do is basically to give you a little bit an overview of where we come from, so a sort of summary of where this inflation came from, and then try to draw a couple of lessons for what it means in terms of how we think about economic policy and the policy mix. And last, but unfortunately not least, the fact that I do believe that Europe today is really not up to the challenge in terms of the choices it's making in terms of macroeconomic policy, not so much for the current crisis, but also for the crisis that will follow. So that, I mean, I repeat, I hope to stay within the more or less 20 minutes I was given. So Let me start with the part on the summary. I mean, I think it can be a quick summary because I think I'm not going to say anything that is unknown to this audience. So we had an inflation episode. The recent inflation episode is not a standard classic textbook inflation episode coming from the overheating of the economy, but rather on the contrary, it's a clear supply side inflation episode. So there was the recovery after COVID that happened with two things together. First, a huge amount of savings, of forced savings that came back on markets, and at the same time, the differentiated impact of the pandemics on different sectors of the economy that created bottlenecks in many crucial sectors. And that was compounded by a very actually interesting phenomenon. Interesting because we don't know, we still don't know exactly how this will turn out to be, whether this will turn out to be permanent or not. A very strong sectoral recomposition of this demand. So not only we had demand that started again after the lockdowns and was not followed by supply, but this demand did not start in the same sectoral composition it had before the pandemics. Just think about the fact that many of us, I think all of us actually, bought many less formal suits and more screens, more comfortable chairs for smart working and the like. We don't know, as I said, whether this will be a permanent or a temporary sectoral recomposition. Some things we thought would be permanent, for example, air travel, came back as actually stronger than it was before the pandemics. Some of them are probably there.
Francesco, sorry.
Yes.
Do you mind making the presentation full page? Because our screen is already minimized.
It is to full page on my screen.
No, we can only see it like the whole PowerPoint interface. Otherwise, I can present it from here if you prefer.
As you wish. I mean, I have it full screen here, so I don't know how to actually.
No, we cannot see it, and it's a bit too small for the screens. So maybe I can present it. It's fine.
Okay, and then I will have to ask you.
And then you just. I know it's a bit more annoying, but you just tell me next slide.
No problem. No problem. So I'll just stop my sharing then. Stop sharing. So now you should not have my screen anymore.
Now you should see it also on the screen.
I see it. Okay, go on. Okay, so this is where I say. So there was, as I say, this sector recomposition of demand, and last but not least, the disruption of supply chains. And of course, all of that was compounded in 2022 by the invasion of Ukraine and the problems on the energy market. If you go forward just a little bit, it should appear a figure, and this figure shows that this type of shock gave us a very heterogeneous inflation rate. Actually, the overall inflation rate, which is the black line you see there, in fact, hid a quite strong variability of inflation rates across sectors. Going from green to red, you have inflation that is below zero. Even at the peak of inflation, around 4% of the goods of the Eurostat basket were still experiencing the deflation. Then you have 0.2 to 4, and more than 4. Well, the main point of this figure, I repeat, is that we didn't have one inflation rate. We actually had many, one for every sector of the economy, and that of course created, and I will come back to that, very many issues in terms of the policy response. If you can go forward a little bit more, in spite of this quite strong characterization of this shock that actually everybody agreed upon, there was a sort of reflex, Pavlovian reflex of policymakers, and the answer to this inflation burst that, let me also remind you, we didn't see in advanced economies for at least 3 or 4 decades. The reflex was an old reflex. Okay, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This is a very famous quote by Milton Friedman that we heard a lot in early 2022. There is a risk of the anchoring of expectations, of a price wage spiral that could actually bring inflation out of control. So the only cure for all of that, regardless of the source of the shock, is a monetary restriction. And if you can go on again, that is exactly what happened. Okay, so we had a a monetary restriction started a little bit earlier in the US than in the Eurozone, but I mean, we followed pretty quickly. There was a peak of inflation a few months later in October 2022, and that was actually hailed as a sort of victory of central banks over inflation. Actually, the problem is a little bit more complex because I think I'm also talking about things you know very well. The literature on the transmission legs of monetary policy tells us that the time that monetary policy needs to actually have an impact on the economy is at least 12 months, most likely 18, and the full effect of monetary policy actually happens only 30 months the shock. So if you go forward, you can see that. In fact, the point I'm trying to make is that the monetary tightening did not really have a major impact on the inflation rate. I'm sorry for the Italian captions of this figure. I didn't have the time to change it yesterday. Basically, what I'm plotting here is the inflation rate of the US and the Eurozone in yellow and red respectively. And I also plotted the indicator that the New York Fed builds of the value chain, of the pressure on value chains. And you can see that with a small lag, there's a very strong correlation. Basically, inflation went up and down following the problems on the supply side of the economy, and monetary policy actually had a very limited impact on that. Actually, very short side note, it would be interesting to do some research on this temporal disconnect between Europe and the United States. If you can go forward, the fact that we did not have that monetary policy played a much lesser role than people currently believe on this inflation that remained sectoral and supply side does not mean that it was not potentially harmful. If you have higher interest rate, you have, of course, a higher cost for investment, both public and private, which actually makes harder the sectoral recomposition of supply that may be required. Investing in the sectors where demand increased becomes harder if you have higher interest rate. We see, and we are seeing actually, we are in the middle of it right now, that monetary policy restriction leads to a slowdown of growth. And then really on that, I don't need to waste your time because you discussed that at length in the very few interventions I could listen at before me. Of course, you have a very strong distributive impact. The channels through this happen are very many. There was a very interesting discussion among economists about the fact that rather than wage price spiral, we actually saw a profit price spiral. There is, of course, not everybody is affected in the same way, and so on and so forth. Go ahead. This leads to actually a point I wanted to make. It's just a complement to what you said. It only adds a small minor element to what you say. This figure that I don't think you can see very clearly is just a very interesting representation of what I just said. It's the inflation rate by quintile of the income distribution that is computed by the Italian Statistical Office. And as you can see, at the peak of inflation, the inflation rate for the lower 20% of the population was twice as high as the inflation rate for the top 20% of the population. That comes from the reasons you see on the slide. I repeat, with this crowd, I don't need to go into the details, from consumption baskets to the capacity to hedge against inflation on financial markets, the indexation of welfare expenditure that was mentioned a couple of times when I was listening to you. So we have that increasing inflation actually has a negative impact on inequality. If you go forward, nevertheless, decreasing inflation, so what I said before, the fight against inflation also hits lower incomes through a different story. And paradoxically, even the stable inflation of the so-called Great Moderation also went and impacted inequality. So it seems basically that, the title of the slide calls for quotes a movie by Ken Loach that you probably saw. But whatever is the macroeconomic situation, it seems that there is a force towards the distribution from lower and middle income to the higher income. And so there is a sort of organization of our economy that has been shaping up in the past 3 or 4 decades that seems to be biased towards increased inequality. So it's a sort of heads I win, tails you lose situation that, of course, and I repeat, I join with what I heard in the discussion before, that of course cannot not have an impact on the social contract. I mean, you cannot have a game in which it's always the same ones who win. After a while, the losers decide that they opt out and they decide to go away and take the ball with them, as it happened when we played soccer as children. So we have a serious problem that goes well beyond inflation of rethinking how the organization of our economies in such a way that this tendency of inequality to increase no matter what the macroeconomic conditions are be stopped. Otherwise, I mean, it's inevitable that the social contract as we know it will come to an end. If you go back to, go forward. So let me go to the 2 lessons I would like to draw from this. The first is that we are probably going in the next few years we are already actually probably in a new normal, a new normal in which there will be a number of structural shocks that will hit the global economy, and so the probability of having major changes in the way the economy works will be higher. First of all, for geopolitical instability that is becoming a new fact. I mean, and the recent American elections certainly didn't make things any easier with respect to that, but also because we are in the middle of a major technological and structural transition, which is the ecological and digital transition, and so it's very unlikely that this will happen in a smooth way. And so we need to prepare to live in a world where policymakers cannot simply devise and find optimal ways to optimal rules to manage an economy that grows at a more or less regular pace. We need to have policymakers that will have to manage the economy, and rather than look for optimal rules, they will rather have to look for satisfying rules to keep the economy within what great economists of the past, Axel Legenfood, called a stability corridor. So don't stop looking for optimal solution, just look for viable, stable solution. And that, of course, means that we will have to trash this technocratic idea that we can reach a first best that actually we never could reach in the past, and even less so in this new changed context. And if we don't live in a world in which we can choose a first best, so an optimal solution, then of course any policy choice, and this is quite important, and I'm happy that of what I could listen so far, it seems that this crowd is at least very much in line with what I'm saying. It's impossible to imagine that any policy doesn't have a choice that needs to be made about who wins and who loses. It's impossible to think of policies that make everybody happy, and so the distribution of resources needs to go back to the center of policy, of the action of policymakers. The second implication of this return of the policy mix is that I think we should trash another idea that was very strong in the past, that is now a bit more shaky, which is this sort of bad interpretation of the Tinbergen principle, by which you need one instrument for objective, that had been basically interpreted as each policy tool needs to be used for one single objective. And I mean, the recent inflationary episode actually showed the actual opposite. If you go forward, we have okay. No, okay, it's okay. It's okay. If you look just if you look at inflation, that is quite clear. We have, I think I have one slide that. Can you go forward for one slide? Sorry. Oh, okay, so we have we have to go back. So what we see with the end of the Tinbergen principle is that we have shocks that have multiple forms and several causes, and have heterogeneous effect on the economy, and so can only be effectively managed if we put in place also a response that deals with multiple instruments. The big mistake that was made, in my opinion, with inflation is not so much the monetary tightening, because I mean some normalization of monetary policy sooner or later needed to happen, and that was maybe a good moment. But the main issue I have with this monetary normalization, first of all, it's its size. Interest rates went way too high, that is for sure, in my opinion. But more importantly, is that monetary policy was kind of left alone. It's as if policymakers said, we are all monetarists, the inflation problem is a central bank problem, we need to do very little. So there should have been more tools mobilized to deal with inflation, and that would have gone in the direction of what I heard before in the discussion of making sure that the impact on the different categories of the population and the cost of inflation was more fairly shared among the different participants to the economy. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this return of the policy mix did not really, I mean, this return of the policy mix since 2008 has put back at the center of the toolbox of policymakers fiscal policy. Fiscal policy had disappeared for many years. It was believed by macroeconomists that the only policy that could be useful to use was monetary policy. We live in the era of maestros, these central bankers that were supposed to be almighty and capable of managing the cycle, and let the fiscal policy that was done by bad politicians aside because it was not very useful. Actually, it was harmful. Okay, since 2008, that was also conviction was very strongly challenged because we had to use fiscal policy a lot. We had to use it in 2008 for the stabilization of the economy in a standard, let me say, Keynesian way, aggregate demand management. There was an increasing consciousness of the fact that we need public investment to be revived in order to ensure both the structural transformation of the economy and in general long-term growth. I mean, just think the last example of that is the Draghi report, where he calls for a substantial increase of public investment. But this idea that public investment has been suffering too much and too long, and this has a negative impact on our economies, has been around for a few years now. And last but not least, of course, the pandemics brought about the importance of public goods such as health and education, for which, of course, the fiscal policy is crucial. What has been missing, I was saying before, is the set of fiscal policies that could have helped actually. I think they should have done most of the fight against inflation. You see the list on this slide. I mean, I think many of these things were discussed this morning before me. They go from income policies, which I repeat are very important, to deregulation, to industrial policy and investment in the sectors that are in which you have stronger supply constraints. But they can go even farther. I mean, there is very interesting work. I'm sure you are familiar with it, by Isabella Weber and co-authors about the importance of using price controls to avoid excessive rent seeking in specific sector. Weber herself goes beyond the caricature of some people about price controls by arguing that this should be targeted and temporary. It's not a question of destroying the working of markets, but simply of correcting it when they don't work very well. There is a very important issue of tax policies to use to try to redistribute the costs and benefits of inflation, etc., etc., etc. This photo here is Arthur Burns. He basically this list is in some of his correspondence in the 1970s. He was the Fed chairman in the 1970s in the hyperinflation era. He has been long considered the worst central banker in history because he was central banker when inflation got out of control in the 1970s. In fact, he was calling for all of these things you see there. So he was actually very modern. I would say he was the best central banker in history, not the worst, in spite of what the common wisdom after him pushed forward. If you go forward, I'm almost done. I have two more minutes. If we look forward, what can we expect? This is a figure. Sorry, once again, the figure is taken from a presentation I did in Italian. So you have a lot of Italy here. You have the inflation rate you have the inflation rate of the Eurozone and of Italy since the beginning of the euro. And if you go forward a little bit, you can see that we can see two phases. Okay, so there is a long phase of below objective. Go ahead, more. A long phase of below target inflation, which led many to discuss to ask the question whether the European economy, and not only the European economy, it's also a discussion that happened in the United States, was headed towards a long phase of secular stagnation, of chronically depressed aggregate demand, and of the economy that the inflation rate that tended to actually go to zero. This is the phase that we all lived. You remember when central banks were fighting to bring the inflation to 2%, but from below, not from above. And then, of course, the second phase that we can see here is the recent inflationary peak that, as you can see, was very high and also quite short-lived. And of course, we can ask which of the two is the anomaly. What will happen in a few years? Will we go back to secular stagnation, or will we remain in an environment in which inflation is potentially structurally higher? And if you go forward, of course, this is 100 million question, but my gut feeling is that it is the second scenario. The first scenario that will materialize. All the reasons for secular stagnation are still there, and most likely we will go back to fighting to keep the inflation rate to 2% and not below. This is just to show you that this drop of inflation was largely unanticipated. This just to give you a key to read this figure. The different years are in different colors, and the full line is the final number, and the striped histograms are the forecast of inflation in previous semesters. And as you can see, inflation was going up. It was higher than previously expected, and going down, it was lower. So the disinflation, this is what is interesting. The yellow bars at the end was actually much faster than what was expected. These are European Commission data. And if you go forward, I think the reason why this inflation is falling so far after the inflationary burst is precisely because the forces behind the secular stagnation hypothesis are still very much present. There is a lot of uncertainty, which is bad for investment. The demographics plays against investment and in favor of savings. The very large stock of of private and public debt, of course, calls for high savings to provision for future payments. And last but not least, the high inequality basically transfers money from those who spend to those who save. And so all of that leads to a structural tendency towards an increase, a chronic excess of savings over investment. This is taken from a recent paper on the natural interest rate, so the interest rate that brings into equilibrium savings and investment. As you can see, it has been negative since 2012. It's an estimate, of course. It's quite hard to perform, but it's an indicator. And as you can see, the blue line has gone up, of course, following the inflationary shock, but it did not even reach zero. So we still are in a situation of very low natural interest rates, which basically captures the idea that there is an excess savings. Next slide, and I'm almost done. Okay, so that means that, if we take the first lesson, we have a structural excess savings. How can we deal with that? If we listen to what I said before, we should have actually mobilized as many tools as we can to try to boost supply, at the same time making sure that demand remains higher and bridges this gap between savings and investment. And instead, once again, I'm saying things that you are, of course, perfectly aware of. If you go to the next slide, which is also my last slide, I think. Instead, Europe seems to be stuck in a sort of Groundhog Day. I think you all saw this movie with Bill Murray, in which we repeat forever the same things. So now we are in a situation where we on one side, the inflation is below the ECB objective and growth is very disappointing. On the other, we have a strong necessity for investment to make sure that we don't fall behind our competitors. You think of Mario Draghi report, and that is quite clear. And the answer is the same cacophonous answer that we saw in between 2010 2015. On one side, the ECB is starting an easing cycle, meaning they're trying to push on the accelerator. On the other, the governments are focused on fiscal concession. I live in France and I teach in France. I mean, for the past 3 months, all the structural problems of France have disappeared. The only discussion you hear today in France is about where to find the money to reduce debt and deficit, as if all the other problems France has had disappeared. It's literally the only thing about which we discuss here in France. And of course, the Stability Pact non-reform it at all, because the Stability Pact, the new Stability Pact is almost as bad as the old one in terms of allowing countries to implement a discretionary fiscal policy. That, of course, will lead up to a sort of contradiction, a potential tailspin. If you drive a car and you try to brake and accelerate at the same time, you know what happens. Okay. So I think it's very hard to be optimistic. I will not leave you with a very positive message here. We don't seem to have any political appetite for a central fiscal capacity, which would solve many of the problems we are talking about. I mean, the new European Parliament doesn't seem to be prone to a common solution, and common tools to be developed. We have the hands of governments still pretty much tied by a fiscal rule that remains procyclical and investment unfriendly. Proof of the pudding is in the eating. As soon as the rule came into force, 7 countries were put in excessive deficit procedure, meaning they need to reduce their deficit in spite of the slagging, slow growth of the economy. So I don't think there is very much room for optimism here, and I think you can go on for a little bit more. The only very thin path that I see ahead that we could hope to actually walk in the next few months is whether this serious political and at the same time economic crisis Germany is going through right now, whether it will reopen the debate in Germany on the virtues, the supposed virtues of fiscal probity, and instead make the German political class understand that there is a need for more fiscal action, both at the national and European level, and that, of course, would hopefully spill to the European discussion on reopening the file of the fiscal rule. But I mean, you all live in Europe, you all work in Europe, so you know better than me that a reform discussion that lasted 4 years, from 2020 to 24, finally painfully closed with an agreement, as disappointing as it is, it's very unlikely that it will be reopened in the near future. So unless there is a big push from Germany stemming from its crisis, even that thin path ahead I see not very likely to happen. And thin should be narrow. This is a mistake when I wrote the slide. I can stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Actually, I'm happy that you managed within the 30 minutes, thinking that it's 20 minutes, but happy to have the points enlightened about the economic tools, fiscal monetary policies not properly used on the EU level in the national context. Actually, happy also to hear, or happy, unhappy, that these situations are not having just winners, but winners and losers. The tools being chosen were not the proper ones, that the lower end earners are actually losers almost in all the situations, and we haven't found economical, but especially political courage, will, and tools to mitigate these impacts on these groups. Given the fact we are having still 16 minutes, including some of my conclusions, we are having space for few speakers. Willem, I can see you. Because I would like to give the floor also to the panelists that are still connected with us. We are still having Mariëlle and Ursula, and we are having Sina, of course, here for a short reflection. So we start with Willem, and we've got Stefano. Strictly 2 minutes, guys, please.
I'll speak in Croatian. Jedno kratka observacija I pitanje. U zadnje...
Thank you. I have a question. Lately, there are different ideological sources that have suggested that we should reduce the dependency of decentralized entities, but we saw what happened in Argentina with the elections, and also what happened with the election of Trump. And there's Josef Stiglitz, winner of the Nobel Prize for the Economy, who states that central banks react to political priorities and that they're not really fully independent and that they don't always work in the interest of citizens. Basically, these are all people from the same circles. They all know each other. But what is your take on this then? How can we influence inflation and economic trends? Should we look at central banks and see how they are organized, and what might the impact on our economy be?
Please, 2 minutes.
Sì, innanzitutto io ringrazio.
Thank you. I would like to start off by thanking our guests for all of their presentations. I'm going to thank Francesco a bit less, because towards the end of your presentation there wasn't much optimism, but I do think that Francesco's presentation gives us some useful indications. First of all, the increase in prices is because of supply drivers to do with energy, increased geopolitical tension, the fact that the production chain needs to be looked at. And in addition to that, and this will become increasingly important, there's the dual transition, the green and digital transition. And in that dual transition, the availability of critical raw materials will become increasingly important, and that will have an impact on green and digital products, and that will be of fundamental importance to the EU. And this inflation approach has a distributive effect. It affects low and fixed salaries and works to the benefit of finance and flexible incomes. And therefore, consumers with lower salaries are defenseless, and the reaction of the EU to this simply does not suffice. It's insufficient and it's inadequate. And if you look at the next multi-annual financial framework, the next MFF, then we'll have to look closely at the EU's response to all of this and see what can be done when it comes to own resources. We must talk about resources that come from a financial transaction tax. We can't get around that. For many years now, that's been put on ice, that discussion, and in most of our governments and ministries of finance and chancelleries. And I think as national trade unions and at European level too, we need to bring the fight to the world of finance and insist on a financial transaction tax. Now, if you read Martin Wolf on behalf of the Financial Times, then he states that the democratic capitalist crisis is caused by giving too much space to the financialization of our economy. And as Francesco was saying, what we need to do is remedy the failure of the market. And this clearly is a failure of the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No more space for any other contributions. I'm just reminding that in the afternoon we're going to be developing, how we can reflect this actually in our messages, in the different opinions. So that's our homework for the afternoon. But now I would like to give to each of the speakers we did have this morning that are still with us, which is Mariëlle, Ursula, Francesco, and Sina. 2 minutes strictly. I will cut you off after 2 minutes. Actually, the main message you would like to send us on the issue of cost of living crisis, or the main uptake, which we could be using and developing actually then further on. And we start with Mariëlle, if she is still with us. Thank you.
Yes, I am, and luckily I also ensure that you can see me. Thank you so much for a very inspiring discussion and inspiring comments. My main recommendation would be to ensure that the siloing in policy making is getting to overcome that, and to join also with the strength of civil society organizations, labor organizations, and society, so like social workers, to ensure that there will be a long-term and sustainable solution towards more absorption capacity to absorb these shocks like inflation, like energy crises, etc., and to ensure that existing inequalities in society are taken into consideration when developing policy interventions. So one size definitely doesn't fit all. Thank you and good luck for the afternoon session.
Thank you very much, and definitely we stay in touch because we are going to be dealing with the issues still further on. Now I kindly ask Ursula for her last comment to this session.
Thank you very much. What I would like to stress at that point is that taking fundamental rights into consideration can help to improve the policies and measures we are taking, and to have this shift from a purely welfare policy approach to a rights-based approach, and to say that they're the rights holders, the citizens are the rights holder, and they have a right to have equal access and to have social protection in all fields. And therefore I would like to ask you, when you draft your opinions, to make sure that when we set up funds and funds measures nationally and particularly on the EU level, that these are in compliance with fundamental rights, but that there is also the effective mechanisms of monitoring data, ex ante impact assessment, and post impact assessment in regard to fundamental rights, as this can really help to improve the spending of the money in policy measures. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to you as well. Sina, your main message.
Thank you all for this inspiring discussion. I think what we can all take away here today is that the cost of living crisis, of course, hits those the hardest that were already having trouble making ends meet, earning lower wages, etc. And youth are disproportionately represented in this group. The impact of this can be felt for young people, not only right now, but for a long time into their later life and career. For us, there are clear ways forward to create better protections, including, as I mentioned, a living wage, social welfare that applies equally, bolstering trade unions, especially for precarious work, and ensuring easier and equal access to housing. I thank you again for inviting me and for taking the time to listen to me today. I hope that we can all contribute to implementing these key improvements in the future, and I wish you a fruitful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Francesco, the floor is yours for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Very quickly on Stefano's remark on the financial transaction tax. I would also suggest that we collectively bring up the other issue, which is the taxation of multinationals. There is very interesting work that is being made at the OECD level. There was an agreement that, while far from perfect, was considered even by many NGOs a quite important step forward. But A, that agreement needs to be fully implemented. B, it needs to be improved. So it's one of the topics on which I would also keep the pressure high. So that would be my answer to Stefan. As for what we should ask the ECB to do, well, certainly we can ask, we could think of ways to change a little bit the working of the ECB to make it less, to make the deflationary bias less important. For example, the ECB had until very recently an asymmetric target, so the inflation needs to be lower than 2%. Now they adjusted that, so this bias is over. But there are very good arguments to think that the inflation target should be higher because of the situation we're living in. Instead of 2%, either 3 or 4%. That could be implemented. And of course, a little bit more ambitious, we could also consider introducing what the United States have, which is a dual mandate, meaning that asking the ECB to also care about growth and employment, not just about inflation. So certainly we can do something to make the action of the ECB less less focused on inflation and so less recessionary in some sense by changing our institutions. But then I would also like to add, what is I think more important is that we change our culture. I mean, I've been working on this issue of inflation in the past 3 or 4 years. I was really stricken by how fast we went back to this old monetarist idea that seemed to be completely discredited both empirically and theoretically. But as soon as inflation resumed, this idea came back very strong. So there is a battle of ideas that we need to continue carrying on, not just institutional change. I'm done, sorry.
I was just waiting for the interpretation. Thank you very much to all the speakers, our panelists, the questions, comments from the audience. I'm not going to be developing on whichever conclusions or uptakes for the moment. Just let me summarize it. This debate and input just showed us that we shouldn't waste a good crisis, because there's a lot of ways out. It's opening a lot of questions and opening also spheres we thought that are locked forever. Means we need to look at it with fresh eyes, and we should be coming with proposals, which is the part of the debate we are going to having in the afternoon. So looking forward to it before we go for the cocktail, which is just outside, because